there are allegations that the reason Ilhan Omar herself was allowed to come to the United States was because of immigration fraud committed by her father. We have with us today the man who has been reporting on this for quite some time. He is the founder and editor of NeutralPOV. That stands for Neutral Point of View. His name is Ashley Rindsberg, and we're delighted to welcome him to the show today. Ashley, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Liz. Great to be here.
All right, Ashley, whenever you utter the words immigration fraud and Ilhan Omar, the first thing that comes to people's minds is this allegation that Ilhan Omar married her brother. I don't know whether she did or not. I mean, we see that on the marriage certificate. We don't have evidence of whether that's her biological brother. We don't know whether it's a nasty rumor or whether it's something that was sort of widely known in Somalia and it traveled across the world here to the United States. However, your research into Ilhan Omar's father, the reason that he claimed refugee status, which enabled him to come to the United States. Can you walk us through this? Because that is actually more fascinating to me.
Yeah, the Omars were brought or came to America under a refugee program. It gave them special ability to enter the U.S. and to have their pathway to citizenship. And that was presuming that they were not serving in the military or the genocidal military of the country which they came from. It turns out that that was actually the case. This was something that was buried by the so-called fact-checking industry and the mainstream media. They called it misinformation. They called it an anti-Muslim smear. But the reality is that Ilhan Omar's father was a colonel in the Siad Barre regime, as a Marxist-Leninist regime responsible for genocide of a neighboring tribe. And he was a senior official in that very regime.
And yet he denied association with that government and claimed he was trying to escape it.
He cast himself as a so-called teacher trainer. This was the term that kept coming up. I've never heard this term before, teacher trainer. Sometimes it was educator. And it was, yes, it was denied by him. It was a idea that was spread by her as well. But most of the heavy lifting was done by Snopes, the, again, so-called fact-checking website. They relied on some very obscure Minnesotan outlet whose own reporter that made this claim was later sued for misreporting. And that claim became the basis for this entire notion that what they had said was misinformation, that in fact, he was a colonel in the Siad Barre regime and not a so-called teacher trainer, as she and the rest of the media claimed.
I mean, listen, the phrase teacher trainer is a red flag to me when that person comes from a Marxist regime. That sounds like a Paulo Freire type of word or sounds like something that might have come out of the Columbia University Teachers College, where the word teacher trainer actually means, yes, deploy teachers to teach children critical consciousness, to view the whole world through a Marxist dialectic. So that phrase in and of itself is not convincing to me. That's almost laughable. So lay out the evidence for us, putting Snopes and PolitiFact and these bogus fact checkers aside for a second. Lay out the evidence for us that Ilhan Omar's father was either active or a colonel in this Marxist regime.
The irony of this entire story is that the evidence that he was actually a colonel in the regime came from the Somali American community itself. So Mr. Omar died in 2020 of complications from COVID. And right after he died, there were a lot of obituaries in local Somali language and English language outlets in Minnesota claiming and celebrating the fact that he was a colonel in the regime. They were not ashamed of it. They thought this was something to be proud of. And they wrote these obituaries detailing his service in the Barre regime as a colonel, detailing how he climbed the ranks within the military, detailing his service in various wars under the Barre regime. And eventually this became so overwhelming. It was reported by a number of outlets in the US as well as in Africa, reporting the same information. So what the New York Times and CNN and CBC and the rest of them got wrong, small outlets in the United States who did not have the same agenda were reporting actually truthfully.
Well, isn't that interesting? So the Somali community who knew Ilhan Omar's father and perhaps shared his political ideology, it sounds like if they were celebrating his quote unquote service in a Marxist regime, they were the ones that were identifying him with that service, which would be very different, by the way. If you, as a young man, served a compulsory role in a military for a regime that you didn't agree with, and then you escape, that would not be a point of celebration upon your death. That would not be included in your obituary. Common sense shows that. So the Somali community was honoring him for his role in this Marxist regime as a colonel in the military. Then there was one news outlet locally in Minnesota that contradicted this, seemingly without evidence, and it was that particular contradiction that Snopes and PolitiFact base their whole, this is not true, you're an Islamophobe for even bringing this up.
Yeah, and that local outlet was written, that story for that local outlet was written by a reporter who was almost sycophantic in his praise and his effusive adoration for Ilhan Omar as this like rising left-wing figure in politics and young and diverse and DEI and all this stuff. And that same reporter was the one who was later sued for a number of misrepresentations. That outlet had to settle that lawsuit. It was the same guy who made these claims. Snopes never mentioned that fact. They didn't investigate that at all, even though it was publicly available information. They just had their claim, calling this misinformation, attaching it to so-called Islamophobia, when in reality it was true. And then what happened is you had this cascade from Snopes. You had PolitiFact making the same claim based on the Snopes claim, based on that one article by this local City Pages Minnesotan outlet. Then Reuters makes the claim, then the New York Times makes the claim, then the networks make the claim. And by that point, if you dare to contradict it, if you dare to even look into it, you get cast as being Islamophobic, as somehow having this misinformation agenda against Muslim people in America.
Like, does anyone even care about that accusation anymore? It's so overused. It's so bogus. It's lost. They're like, the left is like the boy who cried wolf. They use these horrible accusations to try to chill people's speech, but they've overused them so much that people just shrug them off. They're like, whatever, call me whatever. You're just a liar. This does seem about par for the course for Snopes and PolitiFact. They have also so-called fact-checked me multiple times. They, of course, have turned out to be wildly incorrect. PolitiFact, I believe, is funded, or they're a project of the Poynter Institute, which receives money from left-wing, very powerful left-wing interest groups. So you can kind of dismiss them at face value based only on that. So now we get to the implications of this. If it is, in fact, true, and it sounds quite provably true to me, that Ilhan Omar's father was a colonel in the Marxist Somalian regime, and he lied about that in order to get entrance to the United States under a refugee program. And he, of course, brought Ilhan Omar with him because she was, I'm not exactly sure how old she was, but she was a child at the time. What would be the implications of that? I suppose he died, so you can't deport him for committing immigration fraud, but what would be the implications of that for her?
I don't exactly know what the implications are, but they are serious. And this is something that clearly warrants further investigation, because if this all bears out and we have the evidence, we now know that this is actually the case. And the other twist here is that I don't think this is the end of the story regarding her father. I still think there's more out there. I'm working on it right now. I'm hunting down the facts, but I don't think it ends with the so-called his just being a colonel. I think there was much more going on. What we need right now is a proper investigation by the government, where this cannot be trusted in the hands of the mainstream media, because they're not going to do the job. Still today, they're going to run cover for Ilhan Omar. So we really need a DOJ investigation to understand exactly what happened, what was put on the immigration application, and what the reality was, and whether that broke the law.
And that should be, those documents should be something probably DHS would have their hands on, right? Or the sub agencies of DHS that deal with naturalizing citizens.
I would imagine so, and I would imagine that these documents are readily available to anyone who wants to look into this. But again, this was kind of all, it was all just kind of cast under this cloud of Islamophobia, so nobody wanted to touch it. It became toxic and radioactive. And at the time, we remember Ilhan Omar herself was serving on the House Intelligence Committee, and she was thrown off the committee. And that's how bad things got for her right around this period. And it was a lot about her making anti-Semitic remarks, but it was also tied to some of this stuff going on in the background. And again, we don't fully know the truth yet, and I think there's much more to come. But all this stuff, especially being kicked off of that committee, it really signals that there is something serious going on here.